debt and lacked the fiscal space to deal with the pandemic and its economic consequences. When special drawing rights are allocated by the IMF, they go to countries in proportion to their quotas in the IMF. And so they're broadly distributed, and a large share end up going to advanced and developed and middle-income countries. But a substantial share will go, significant resources will go to the poorest countries that are most in need. And importantly, many advanced countries have indicated a desire and willingness to channel portions of their own allocations back to provide further support to these low-income countries. For example, the IMF has a poverty reduction and growth fund that many countries are likely to either lend or donate portions of their own SDR allocations. And that will really multiply the impact of an SDR allocation on the poorest countries in the world. You mentioned accountability. We do want to make sure that the SDR allocation goes to support relief and economic support in the lowest income countries. And we're working with other countries and the IMF to design a disclosure and reporting framework that would enable us to see how the SDRs that have been allocated have been used and to monitor the ways in which they've supported the purposes that we have in mind.
Wonderful. Next question comes from the chair, president and CEO of William Blair, but more importantly, the chair of the board of directors of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, John Edelson.
Thank you, Ivo, and thank you, Secretary Yellen, for being here today. In your letter to the G20 about 6 weeks ago, you urged the G20 to go big and take significant fiscal and monetary policy actions and avoid withdrawing support too early in order to foster economic growth. So a couple kind of related questions to that. How big is big when you encourage them to go big? Is there a limit to how much debt either the US or the G20 can incur? And at what point does it become inflationary? And if we and they go big, how do we withdraw support without causing another recession?
Well, those are great questions. Congress recently passed a $1.9 trillion package, the American Rescue Plan, to address the pandemic and its economic consequences. And I would describe that as going big. The purpose of the package is to address the needs of American households, families, companies that have been adversely affected by the pandemic, to avoid scarring, to avoid damage that could permanently impact the ability of individuals and families to get to the other side of the pandemic and get back on track with their lives, and to avoid the failure of small businesses that are the lifeblood of their communities and that provide so many jobs to Americans. So we've designed the package to direct support to make sure that people, and especially the minority and low-wage workers who've been so adversely affected by this crisis, to make sure that they have income during the time that they are jobless, to make sure that they have enough food to eat, to make sure that they can keep a roof over their head and don't lose a family home. It provides money to state and local governments for a variety of programs to address the burdens of the pandemics, to get their local economies on track, and to begin to address infrastructure needs that were highlighted by the pandemic, such as the absence of broadband that penalized so many rural families and families in low-income areas when their children needed that in order to participate in school. Can we afford this? Well, I believe that we do have fiscal space to be able to afford it, in part because we've been in a low interest rate environment in the United States, and that's been true among developed countries generally in recent decades, and for reasons that I believe are not just transitory, but reflect longer-term structural problems. So in spite of the fact that US debt has risen quite a bit relative to the economy, if you go back as far as 2007, when US debt to GDP ratio was 35%, it's now risen to around 100%, but the interest burden on the debt because of these interest rate trends has been completely unchanged. Will it be inflationary? I strongly doubt that it's going to cause inflationary pressures. We're in a deep hole where the US economy is still down around 9 million jobs. And if we were to count individuals who have dropped out of the labor force to take care of children, and because of health concerns, the true US unemployment rate is close to 9%. The Congressional Budget Office estimated that without the American Rescue Plan, the economy would probably take until 2024 to get back to full employment. But I'm hopeful that if the vaccination program proceeds as it has been and is successful, that we can get back to full employment next year. We had, before the pandemic, an unemployment rate of 3.5%, and the problem for a very long time has been inflation that's too low, not inflation that's too high. If the package did prove to be inflationary, we have the tools to address it. So I see the risks as asymmetric, that I worry much more about long-term adverse consequences from not doing enough than problems that would result from doing too much. So I do believe we have the fiscal space to act boldly. I think it's important in mitigating the suffering of the pandemic and the long-term adverse consequences to US potential output if we fail to do so. It's important for us to learn the lessons from the 2008 financial and economic crisis. We had a very slow recovery after that crisis. It took us almost a decade to get the economy fully back on track. And it's important that we not repeat that experience. So I think that we're doing the right thing. And longer term, the President Biden and Vice President Harris have proposed now a recovery plan that's addressed at dealing with longer term challenges facing the US economy. Slow growth, this is a package that will, over a decade, invest in our crumbling infrastructure, in our roads, bridges, highways, broadband structures, the electric grid, invest in people, giving them the tools and training they need to be productive, in research and development, over the long term, these investments are the cornerstone of making our economy competitive.
Secretary Yellen, I know you have a hard stop at 1:45, so thank you so much for joining us today, honoring us with your virtual presence for your first big international speech. We appreciate you being part of our council family now. We hope to see you in person in Chicago, in the not too distant future. In the meantime, I join everyone here in thanking you for your remarks and for being with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ivo, and thank you for hosting me. Much appreciated.